Hi, it is Ignorance Week at our Raw Material. I am Tavish Carduff, here to talk about this week's pillar, ignorance. At our Raw Material, we try to treat ignorance with a little more respect than we normally do out in the world. I like to use the example of driving down the street, someone cuts you off, automatically they're an asshole. We don't necessarily know anything about them, just that they're an asshole. And when we make those kinds of assumptions and our judgment is in the way, we're not taking in how little we actually know about a situation. We have all been taught to capitalize on our knowledge, on what we know. And that is kind of stock and trade for people who consider themselves intellectual or intelligent or above the curve intellectually. And I can tell you, most of us feel that we are. We just all look at life differently. And when we come up against somebody who's seeing a situation differently than we are, we can only see through our own perspective and lens. Even as we try to take on somebody else's conditions, we do it with our own framework because there's only so much bandwidth that we allow and know. Ignorance itself is an opportunity for knowledge. There is no intention around ignorance. I get into discussions with Quan about willful ignorance on occasion, but I'm going to argue that those aren't the same thing, and not knowing something because you don't want to still has an awareness of the thing. Ignorance is childlike. Ignorance is simply not knowing. So when somebody simply doesn't know something and we shame them, all of a sudden they're pulling in energies that are going to get trapped in their physical body that aren't going to serve them. Ignorance falls in the physical weeks because what we don't know, as we encounter it in the world, it creates feelings within us. We don't know something, we tend to feel less secure than we did when we knew everything that was going on. So when we're in a phase of learning, or when we're in a phase of being open to something that we don't know, there is a vulnerability that comes with that. We have to breathe. We have to take it in. And when we are made to feel small rather than open, that's when we start to pull in these types of feelings that will get stuck in the body and come out later in some sort of illness or injury. The emotional things that we don't tend to deal with reside in our body. And we are largely ignorant of how our mind-body connection actually works. At our Raw Material, we look at examining our judgments and our beliefs as they occur from an objective point of view rather than just sticking with the judgment. Noticing when we've made a judgment and realizing, oh, where does that come from? Relating it to wherever its origins are, and then also realizing that we can take a breath and remove those stuck places from our body. Ignorance is a place where each of us feel incredibly inadequate. When we are faced with things that we don't know, our support system is not as solid. And it leads us into spaces that can create defensiveness. It keeps us from listening. It moves us from a space of comfortability into feeling like we need to somehow protect ourselves. Judgment falls under the category of ignorance. And we all do so much judging that we don't even realize we do it. The way that I talk in each of these videos, I get through the end and I notice, wow, there's judgment, there's judgment, there's judgment. Because when we start to see our judgment as something that we just objectively do, as a natural part of who we are, then we don't have to defend it. And it becomes interesting to start tackling those judgments and seeing them not with a negative eye, but with an eye that has us looking for where we got tangled to begin with, looking for where our belief system created limitations. And when we can go undo the limitations that have been created in our thought patterns, that's when we really start to open up the space of everything that we protect emotionally. Let it breathe. Let ourselves actually expand with everything that we are. Take it out, look at it, and realize what all we can learn from it. There's so much more present, readily available within us than we allow because we try to hide so many things that we don't want to think about or feel about. Ignorance is the place where we start to put those things together. So we lay our ignorance on the table or that of somebody else and just start to look at how we support a situation, not how to judge it or tear it down. I think it's interesting the way that we expect knowledge from other people. You're 25 years old, you should know by now XYZ. That makes sense if we all grew up in the same specific environment, but the fact is we didn't. We grew up with all different mentors. Even our own siblings would have had a separate experience with their mentors and their trek through school, friends, social things, and even experiences with parents and relatives, different for each person. We exploit those differences when we could really use them as an opportunity to cure our own ignorance, to gain knowledge rather than place judgment. And our judgment makes us feel secure. Our judgment solidifies our belief and our knowledge of what somebody else had going on or who they are or what their character is. But all that does is keep us safe. It doesn't actually transform our ignorance into knowledge. I drive down a busy street every day, and as I watch people cut me off and do all kinds of things, I've gotten away from the practice of calling them names, more into the habit of wondering what is actually going on. Why? And it's made it a lot more interesting of a drive. I can't know the answers to those questions, but the questions themselves keep me from judgment. The ideas that I can play around with lead me to the ideal playground and imagining something for them. If somebody cuts me off or starts to irritate me in traffic, I do my best to imagine a situation where what they did was okay. To imagine something that just went on with them that makes me say, go ahead, I'm okay. Without holding it in my body, without taking it for later, just letting them have the right of way because it seems like they need it. That takes a breath. That takes a couple breaths sometimes. But getting in the habit of doing that changes the way that we hold just this one simple thing. And as soon as we start looking at our regular judgment and how we hold it, pulling it apart, looking at what really is going on underneath our judgment, we start to see ignorance as something interesting. I started this year with all of my intentions ready. I had my values set. I had a plan for how the year was going to start, and I was ready to go. Primed and pumped. The world offered me an entirely different set of circumstances, and the pillar of ignorance plays a big part in my ability to roll with it. My parents' health is in question again. My husband got COVID. We were sidelined at home, and the things that I was planning on doing haven't come to fruition. What I have had is a lot of time to work on some other things, back burner, but where was I going to find the time? So I've pulled out some old root things, started working with those, and I've had to rework based on my values because family's up there is important to me. So holding that support, also not risking anyone else's health by giving them COVID, another value I didn't expect to employ until faced with it. Just like prior to the pandemic, there was a whole set of knowledge that we didn't think we'd ever need, and most of us didn't possess. Now we could each write a paper. There's been a lot of information out there, and we've had to learn fast. That's what Ignorance Week is about, and that's what that pillar of ignorance is if you keep going back to it. Reminding us that we don't know everything. In fact, the percentage of what we know in the entire world is so small that it's silly for us to sit in ego about our own knowledge or intellect when there is so much that we are unable to know. I'll leave you with this. As a kid, I was so interested in the idea that we have more brain power than we use by a lot. So I would challenge each of us this week to pay attention to all of the things that you don't know rather than defending what you do. Just be curious. See what you can learn from observing. See what happens when you breathe into that person cutting you off and create a backstory for them rather than define them, judge them, and move on. See how much easier your day goes. See if you feel more peaceful. Ignorance has the opportunity to transform our physical body as we uncover those spaces that are stuck, breathe into them, and let them go. With that, I don't know what all comes in. I know what comes in for me, but I can't know what comes in for you, because to the extent that we share human qualities, I'm not in your mind. I don't know what serves you and what you need. But paying attention to where you hold ignorance will lead you to that for yourself. And that is interesting and exciting. Have a great week. We will see you next week to talk about emotion. Thank you.